it's sort of weird because the pond is like almost directly in the center. And a lot of those cages the pond is environmental, and they put like one perforated line all the way to the back of the lot, which is probably not, it's called 100 yards. I don't know if it's quite that long, but that's really the only discharge line. It doesn't really take on the video, but it does take out the basement. They're like, why do we figure out
Why are
we're all supposed to be together?
Good evening. I'd like to call to order the February 27th meeting of the Grand Hill Schools Board of Education. Please rise and join me with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome all. It's good to see many of you here in the audience, and I'm sure there are many at home as well. Also a special welcome to John Crump, who just before this meeting was sworn in as our latest Board of Education member. So, Ms. Kierlo, if you call roll, please.
Mr. Miller?
Here.
Mr. Wolf?
Here.
Ms. Deeds? Here. Mr. Crum?
Here.
Ms. Shaw? Here.
Very good. Do I have a motion for approval of the agenda?
So moved.
Second. Thank you. Roll.
Ms. Shaw? Aye. Mr. Wolf?
Aye.
Ms. Deeds? Aye. Mr. Crum?
Aye.
Mr. Miller?
Aye.
Okay, staff report. First one is actually not staff, it is students, which is always fun. So Grace Siebold is our teacher of our entrepreneurial and finance classes at the high school. She's part of CTEC's program, so she can introduce the project, and then the students are going to give their presentation.
Awesome. Good evening, y'all. Our students here tonight were part of the Strategic Entrepreneurship classes last fall. It was a half-year course this year that incorporated growing their entrepreneurial mindsets, developing businesses of their own, and understanding all that goes into creating a business. The students were challenged with creating a unique business idea. This first idea was called the Ace of Shop. It was first created by Elena Kale, Christian McCurry, and Lily Gobert. They then split classes after voting on 2 strong ideas and spent 9 weeks growing in a Shark Tank-esque environment to develop everything from financing to a marketing plan to real social media. They created a model. And then they presented this to a group of over 15 business professionals as well as 2 middle schools virtually. I don't think they knew that though. They were able to present their ideas and were questioned back and forth. Since then, the idea has caught a hold of CTEC and multiple Granville High School people to try and integrate this into the classroom next year as a work-based learning experience. Today is information only. We are still in the works of developing how it would work and where it would work and kind of all the concepts there. But I'm going to let the kids kick it off here with their presentation.
fashion out.
or gotten dress coded, or wanted some Granville merch?
Well, we have the perfect solution for you. The Aces Shop.
The Asia shop would be selling many different products. These products are commonly supplies in other school stores. These items would be t-shirts, sweatshirts, school supplies, hygiene products, spirit merchandise, and more. We would advertise the Asia shop on our social media accounts such as Instagram, Snapchat, Twitter, and more. We would also partner with Lewis Media, Blueprints, and use Granville Parents Win Now, which is a Facebook group. The Asia shop creates problem solvers. It teaches students to take pride in their work, gives an outlook on school funds, and teaches financial lessons. We will have partnered with Just Right to provide Reading and Randall schools pre-made merch. We will also take donations of clothing from older students who want to get rid of their items. And we will also take lost and found items after 90 days. Our competition will be Evers, Gear, and other Granville merchandise vendors as they sell similar items as us. This is our dream board that we made at the beginning of our product just to show what we want to see in our shop. We included a location, which is right outside of the gym. We have Granville merchandise and also school supply items.
The strength of our shop is that we have the opportunity of learning and have creative freedoms. We also give opportunities for volunteering to the students, and we open during game and school hours. By the other way, the weakness of our shop is that we are not able to sell snacks, and that the shop relies on students. The opportunities of our business are, well, obviously financial reward, and that we can also provide the students with a job, and families and students with products. We can also connect with Blueprints and Lewis Media to advertise our shop. Finally, the threats of our shop is that the lack of school approval, and that we are competing with the ACES players, and the lack of funding and the advisory.
So the opportunity of our shop is market is primarily made of students and parents to athletes. And donated clothes can be sold to students who are dress coded or in need of clothes. So our product is outside the gym, and it's near the senior study hall, and it's a ticket booth. And we'll sell Granville merchandise and other various items that may be needed. And then that's the length of the store. And then right there we'll have like a collapsible counter for like a display case and a little bit more storage. And our key participants, the customers will be students, school employees, and parents and families. And our suppliers would be Mr. Winning, Becca, Just Right, and Donations. And for our reports, the employees will report to the shift manager every day, and the shift manager reports to the president daily. And then the accountant will report to the vice president every day, and then at the end of the week, we'll report to the president. And here's some of our products. We have t-shirts for $15, and donated t-shirts for $5, sweatshirts for $30, and donated for $12, and hats for $12.
We'll have a couple different payment options. We'll have cash, obviously, and the card with the square. Some student involvement. Students will be able to design their own Granville ACE designs. They can submit them, and we will take them, decide which one we're going to use for the time being, maybe a month or so, depending on how that works out. And it'll be up on the t-shirts in the store. They'll be also working the shop and getting work-based learning experiences through the classroom and the store environment, just learning how to manage the store and how it works. We also created a ACES Shop website to make sure that people can buy all this stuff online if they can't come into the school and go to the store. We have an actual demo website that we created just to check it out, which you can check it out with that QR code. Through here, we'll also have the option to customize t-shirts if a parent wanted to put their kid's last name on the back, then they can see that and just kind of support their kid.
So we did a survey to send out to students and parents and teachers. And then we got the responses for age, and most people said they were over the age of 30. We asked if the ACES shop would be useful or helpful in Greenville High School, and we got all yeses, and some people just gave us feedback on what we could do with the shop. We also asked what you'd like the ACES shop to be in Greenville High School, and people said yes, and we also got more feedback. We then did a survey on just high school students, and we got a mixture of freshmen and juniors as our highest responders. We asked how many times would you visit the ACES shop, and the most one people selected was a couple times a month. We then asked would the ACES shop be beneficial, and we got all yeses and one no.
Our projected startup costs for our store would be a 12-month accounting software, which could keep track of our sales, store hardware such as like registers, the Square system, storage systems, etc. A website setup that could be around like $35, $36 a month, and advertisement. This is a profit loss statement for probably our first year. Our income would be around $15,800, with our cost of goods being $8,000, which would make our gross profit around $7,000, and our other expenses being around $2,500, which would come out to a net income of $4,700. Ways we would keep track of money is a cash receipt journal, which could be done by a shift manager at the end of the day, filling out all the receipts that went out throughout the day. Accounting software like Quicken or QuickBooks that could keep track of storage and sales. A balance sheet that would also be filled out by like a cashier or the shift manager. And then daily deposits that would be given to the club advisor and then taken to the bank at the end of the day. These are some of our sales forecasts for some of our items, such as a sweatshirt. Our units in pipeline is how many units we will currently have. Our conversion rate is how many of those units will turn into sales. And then our price per unit being at $30 would turn out to revenue around $2,700 for 1 year. And then we'll have a pipeline growth rate as units will increase year by year. So will the conversion rate, and the the price every couple of years will also increase, with our revenue going up as well. These are a couple other items that we have at our store, with $1,000 per year for a t-shirt, $1,060 for hats, and around $675 for blankets, and for mugs around $315. Any questions?
Would it be staffed during the entire school?
We're looking to staff it mainly during like ACE period and lunch, where everybody has a free day.
If anyone has any other questions, feel free to email me. Our DECA leadership team, which some of you guys are DECA here, and we also have our DECA president present with us. DECA is kind of helping spearhead this into a program next year and incorporating that into our learning system. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out.
I really appreciate you thinking about it like a real business, right?
Mhm.
Going through all the various aspects of truly starting up your own business, from the finance to the competition to all those kinds of things. That's kind of what it's going to be. It has to kind of be sustainable by itself. So, not a critique at all, but I'd encourage you to think about like ways you can make sure that it's like sustains beyond you. Like,
Yeah.
what are the returns to the students that are working there? What happens with funding? How do you kind of ensure that? And another thing that might be helpful in that way is to think about like partnering organizations. Like you didn't think of them as competitors because they're not really, but all of our booster organizations, you know, the athletic boosters and the PTO and all those groups sell merch as well. And, you know, I don't think you should think of yourself as competition, but like I'm not sure what model there might be for partnering with them, because they already have lots of t-shirts that are printed. Maybe you could sell some of them and keep part of the profit or something like that. So I like the way you just really wrapped around all the different aspects of what it takes to actually make a business, right? Thinking about the profitability of it and so forth. And I encourage you to A, make it sustainable, like make sure like who's going to pick it up next year, and then B, kind of think about partnerships, right, with suppliers or other organizations that already support and have merchandise, for example, and so forth. So great job. I really appreciate the presentation.
Yeah, to kind of go off that there, after this presentation was presented in December, we have, as CTEC, been working on growing the idea to make it sustainable. The goal would be that entrepreneurship would become a full year course, and it would be run directly after or before the ACE period, so that would be a conjoined class. And with that, any partnerships, so we're looking at partnering with the art club, the tech club, the environment club, and we have a meeting later this week with Just Right to partner with. We've already talked with the athletic director about being at games and possibly seeing what kind of incentive there could be for students to work those, whether it's a scholarship later on, or maybe profits are coming back to DECA in that sense. But working hand in hand is something that's gone above and beyond this presentation. So we're really making it, trying to make sure that this could be a thing.
One, as a older Granville parent, I have lots of vintage for you. Lots. But could everybody introduce themselves?
Yeah, just would be great. Yeah.
So we know.
Say your grade too.
Oh, I'm a freshman at Granville High School.
I am Jaime Soler. I am a sophomore.
I'm Christian Curran, I'm a junior.
I'm Elena, and I'm a junior. I'm Lily Gobert, I'm a junior.
I'm Dylan Prudman, I'm also a junior.
Adam?
And the DECA president?
Yes.
Yes, my name is Spencer Beckett, I'm a junior as well.
That's great.
We also had one more, he couldn't be here tonight, but Adam Bunyard is a senior who was part of this
Great.
presentation.
Thank you. Great presentation. Appreciate it.
Love the shirts too.
Or I'm going to let them go because they do have a concert.
Yes.
Some of them have to get to.
We are very, accustomed to that.
Yes.
So
we will let them go.
feel free to
Yeah. Get out.
get out of here.
Cool.
Or you
Thank
can
you
sit
so
down for
much.
financial board.
You
You
could.
can hear the monthly financial board.
It is.
My ace shot. I'll get a photo of the. Running in heels is art.
All right, so let's jump into the first, the January 2023 monthly financial report. I'll have a brief transition, and then we'll move into the discussion about the cash balance policy. So first, looking at our cash balance comparison on a monthly cycle, and last month it looked like December was actually going to be our low point, but it turned out January cash actually decreased slightly. That's really due to a timing of when we receive, first of all, how much our income tax payment is, and when we receive advance payments from the county auditor for property taxes. So nothing to worry about there. We'll continue to build back up our cash balance as those property tax advance payments come in, and then once we receive the settlement, hopefully next month. Looking at revenue for the month of January compared to last January. Local taxes were actually down a little bit, $258,000, and that is due to a decrease in the income tax payment. We are still seeing an increase in the income tax with payments that are made through withholdings, so those individuals who have payroll. Those payments are continuing to increase over prior year. However, payments with returns and estimated payments are down about 17% over prior year. Then state revenue, that $800,000 decrease, that's really throwing a wrench into due to the timing of when the funding formula was implemented last fiscal year. So we're going to continue to see a timing variance there. But looking at year to date, by the end of the year, we will be caught up and we'll be around where we were last year.
For the income tax, those would be returns that were filed for the January 15th estimated taxes, so we get those that quickly, we get those in January?
No.
Those would have been
So
from-
most
when would those have been
likely,
filed?
the reason why we're seeing a catch up now is typically people who file extensions are those who have payments with returns and do the estimated payments process. They're not typically people who have to make their payments through payroll. So a lot of times those people requested an extension, and then the timing of when we receive that is actually in January. So if you received an extension on your taxes for 2022, that would have been included in this January payment.
So those tax payments would have been made the prior October or whatever, right? Because an extension is until later in the year?
Sorry,
Okay.
we had
I'm sorry.
multiple questions at the same
What do you
time.
mean?
2021.
Yes, I'm sorry, yes, 2021. And then
Okay,
what was?
all right.
the
I'm
question?
wondering how
Sorry.
fast they turn around, like when the tax payments are made, estimated tax payments are made, how quickly they come to the district?
So this would be, let's see, let me back up. So it would be, I believe it's September, October, November of the prior year.
That comes in January?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Then looking at year to date, so I mentioned just for the payment in January, income tax was down, but year to date, we are still up over prior year. So that's what's being reflected in the local tax line. And then again, we're seeing still a timing issue with the state revenue. And then all other revenue looks like it's up significantly. And again, that's the advance payments due to ESSER funds that we had to advance this year. Okay, on the expenditure side, we're really close in alignment with where we were last year. And a big reason why salary and benefits are only up $42,000 over last year is due to the 8% reduction in medical insurance premiums that we received for 2023. Normally, we would see a little bit higher of an increase in that line item. But that is positive news that will carry forward through the rest of the calendar year. Then looking at fiscal year to date, salary and benefits, again, base salary increases steps. We've added additional positions this year due to enrollment growth. And then all other expenses up about $500,000, and that again is the HVAC project portion of the elementary and then also the high school.
And the HVAC project is complete?
I believe the last
I'm
report
sorry.
said it's like 97% complete, so we will still have another payment that will hit this line item.
And I was referring to the elementary. Are you talking about both, or?
The high school was completed in the fall, so that's what's been paid out of here. The elementary, since it was partially federally funded, when those invoices come in, what I was doing is paying out of the federal funds piece first, to use up those funds. So a portion of it has been paid out of general fund. The last remaining invoice or two will hit here as well.
Okay.
So it's a good transition into looking at all of our COVID-related funds. So again, in total, just under $3 million, which this does contribute or will have an impact when we start talking about the cash balance here in a couple minutes. But nothing has really changed on this graph. This shows how all of our funds in total were spent. So what I have on the next slide are just those sources that we have left to spend, but this is how in total all of our funds were spent. So again, these are just the remaining 5 sources of the approximately 10 that we had. So what we have left to spend is represented by the orange bars, and you can see it labeled kind of what those are set aside to do. So while they're not all fully spent, they are all allocated for a specific purpose.
I have a question. When you say
Yes.
intervention, are you talking about a specific intervention position, or are you talking about intervention services?
Intervention services, so like summer school, so it's various staff members working with small groups of students.
Same for the other 2, the temporary intervention, or is that?
Do you want to talk about
Yeah,
that? That is a
temporary-
staff position.
That
but-
is a staff
Okay.
position,
Okay.
and would be temporary because as soon as the funds expire, we're going to sunset that position. But it's really for COVID recovery purposes.
All right, thanks.
Yes, because some of these sources have a learning loss recovery component, and that's one of the allowable.
And even though we have new regulations around dyslexia and other interventions, we are not getting any extra funds. I mean, I know that's a state requirement, but we don't get any extra funds for that.
Now, the governor did articulate his #1 priority being literacy, and he has released his executive budget, but that has not gone through the budget process. There may be an allocation that is dedicated to literacy specifically,
Okay.
but it's yet to be determined.
Also, typically in those cases, like, they tend to just pull money from here and
Yeah.
put it over here.
Okay.
So it's kind of like a shell game too. So, I mean,
It's-
seriously, that's just something to keep in mind.
Yeah,
that it's
we call the
not
state
necessarily-
budget like the Prego moment. Remember the old commercial? It's in there. Yeah.
I didn't know
Yeah.
much about television as a kid, to be honest.
Yeah.
I don't get a lot of those references. I really don't.
Yeah, Fred and I can relate.
I don't watch television. You can ask my mother's in town. We can
I'll
ask
show you the commercial online later.
But then I had a question about, okay, so those funds, when you say literacy, is that literacy specifically for kids diagnosed with dyslexia? Because I know that was a big thing. Or is it just literacy in general, as long as we're doing certain programming?
To be determined.
Okay.
But dyslexia itself, that legislation did not have a funding component associated with it. It had a lot of training requirements, but
Yes.
it didn't have
Money to train.
money to associate with that training.
Gotcha.
And those requirements.
We may be able to use some Title II funding for that, but that would come out of
What's Title II again? Can you remind me?
professional development.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Brittany, do you have any idea, in comparison to other districts, how much we got in COVID-related funds?
Yeah, so I don't have the exact numbers, but generally how each of these sources were allocated were by looking at your economically disadvantaged percentage. So being a higher wealth district, we probably received the lowest amount of funding in the county. Because if you remember back to 2020, when the state cut our funding, they did that based on Title I numbers, and then when they allocated out the federal funds, they did it based on the same metric. So we had our funding, our general fund funding cut at a greater rate, and then we received less COVID-related funds to make up for it. So it's kind of on that same metric. Okay, switching gears a little bit, I wanted to provide a quick athletic complex update because we are working down the receivable balance. So if you recall, the athletic complex project was a 50-50 public-private partnership where the district advanced the funds for the private portion so that those donations could be pledged over multiple years. So I wanted to show that those donations are in fact coming in, and the receivable balance is, at the time of this report, $117,000, but I do know that Rotary wrote a check for $15,000 for their pledge, so they have funds in their account, so the actual receivable balance is probably under $100,000 at this point. So that's great news. Wanted to highlight that partnership as well as the payment back to the district for that advance.
That's fantastic. What a great example of a partnership with the community to help out. So we couldn't have done that facility in that scale without them, and we did an really nice job.
Yeah, especially during, the timing of it actually worked out great to get it done when we did, before construction costs skyrocketed, and it was a miracle that during that time that we pulled that off right at the beginning of the pandemic.
If you recall, the aggregate budget was about $4.8 million on the project. Right now, it's almost the identical project in a neighboring school district is close to $8 million. So just to give you scale of inflation right now, very different environment.
I think we also scaled it appropriately, I guess, right? We didn't really put in tons of bells and whistles and fanciness just for show, right? We did the important stuff to make sure that all of our athletes and all of our students in other capacities could use the facility. And I think that was the right way to scale it. I think there's often too many examples of, a little over the top in terms of many of these projects that we've been able to hold in check here and do the right thing for the students.
Just one clarification, we did put a bell in. It's the big one. So there is already one bell. It was there. It was repurposed, but it was a victory bell. Just for clarification.
And it's been well used.
Yes, it has.
Okay, and then lastly, for the monthly financial is our cash reconciliation. So next I'm going to move into some transition data to kind of set the stage for our cash balance policy, unless there's any other questions about the monthly financial. Okay. So I wanted to first start with some context and some comparison data for districts that Greenville is often compared to. So it's helpful to look at Licking County, but more often than not, we are compared to these other Central Ohio districts who look more like us. So this graph is showing the performance index from the state report card, as well as operating spending per pupil. So really the takeaway from this data is that Greenville's providing superior performance at a lesser value, at a better value, because we're spending less per pupil and getting the highest performance index out of that group. So I thought that this was a pretty powerful graphic to start with to kind of provide some context, because we can look at the monthly financial and compare year over year, but that's only comparing ourselves to ourselves. So how do we compare to other districts? And this shows that we compare very well. Then looking at a little bit longer historical perspective for year-over-year change and how we compare to inflation as an even larger scale metric. So what we did was we have 15 years of historical operating expenditure per pupil, as well as the 5 forecasted years. The different colors of each bar just break down salaries, benefits, purchase service, and all other expenses, just so that you can see that a majority of our expenditures are related to salary and benefits, so almost 80%. So really, what's driving any of this change is almost always related to staffing. So the orange line then represents inflation over the historical period. So we took 2007 as the base year and applied the inflation rate to that dollar value in 2007 to see how that would track over time. So basically this is showing that in some years our expenditure per pupil was below that inflationary calculated rate. In some years it was above, but by 2022 we were just over where inflation is saying that we should be. And again, this is very powerful because it's showing that we really are being fiscally responsible. We really are keeping in check our largest expenditure items of salary and benefits. And any growth in those line items are almost always related to growth in enrollment. That's why looking at it on a per pupil basis is so important. And then showing that, obviously, I'm not going to throw a number up here as far as projecting inflation. That's well beyond me. But you can see that if you were to, generally extend this trend, we continue to be in alignment in the forecasted years as well.
Why is 2024 so much higher?
In that year, we have some allocation for capital expenditures, so land acquisition, capital improvements, those kind of things.
Okay.
And same with 2020. So 2020, we also had capital improvements in the athletic complex. So some of those outliers, there are one-time expenditures that are driving. Yep.
I wasn't going to ask about 2020. I just know what that was. But.
It's great to have a long-term history, though. Just, I think we get caught up in a little bit like this year versus last year and so forth. But I think if you look at this, like, got a long-term trend of, a great value, right? And if you look at the long-term trend of the, performance of the schools as well, you can see it's always been great, right? And it will continue, right? And for me, it shows there's no big surprises. And also is really impressive, given the benefits line, which has increased drastically with healthcare costs going up. We've still managed to keep in check the overall expenditure per pupil, right? And there's a lot of organizations, whether they be public organizations or private companies and things like that, would be really jealous about this kind of control of cost effectively. So I'm proud of this, and I think it shows a good long-term trend.
Okay, moving on to the next slide. Basically the same concept here, except on the revenue side. So again, 15 years of history of operating revenue per pupil, but it's giving us a different picture. So unlike expenditure per pupil, which tends to increase marginally year over year over a long period of time, revenue moves more in a step pattern. So we were pretty flat from 2007 to 2013. Then we passed a property tax. So that gets phased in over 2 years, and then we reach another step. Then we pass the income tax. That gets phased in over 3 years, and then we flatline again. And that's, again, due to the fact that we don't receive additional revenue as property values go up. So I will highlight, let's see, 2020 and 2023 are update and reappraisal years. So for example, in 2023, we're forecasting a 30% increase in property values. That's not going to be paid until 2024, so hang with me here. But what you can see, if once you phase that in over time, that 30% update in 23, we're not seeing any additional revenue in property tax over the next 3 years from the time of that implementation. And in fact, revenue per pupil in total goes down over time because our forecast is projecting an increase in enrollment at the same time that we're projecting revenue to stay almost completely flat. So very different picture here than on the expenditure side.
Yeah, and also something to point out, just like I quickly looked at it and thought, oh, we're going to pass a levy, in May, so boom, things are going to go up again the way you showed me here with the property tax. But that's not the case because it is a renewal.
Yeah,
It's just a renewal. It's exactly what we've been getting, so.
Yeah, exactly. Okay.
And also to point out, it is included in this chart,
Yes.
right? So without
Yes.
the
Oh,
income
yeah,
tax,
yeah.
if we were to look at 2024 and
Yeah,
beyond,
we would.
those parts would go away, and you would see a drastic difference in.
Correct.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Yep, that's good clarification. Okay, so the combination of these two slides really, I think, sets the stage, transitions us into a conversation about cash balance. Because you can see from these two graphs that there's a difference between how much we receive in revenue in any given year versus how much we spend. It almost never aligns and is never spending exactly how much we bring in. We build up our cash balance after we pass a levy, whether it be property tax or income tax, and then spend down from there until we pass another levy. So what determines kind of the amount of time between the levies that we have to pass is all based on how much carryover cash we have to fund those expenditures in the years where we have less revenue. So that is the purpose of having a cash balance. Having a cash balance policy, specifically a minimum, provides us with a threshold to keep in mind to understand when we would need to start discussing a new levy. Okay, so it's very common for districts to have a minimum cash balance policy for that purpose. We currently have a guideline based on a different metric. The current guideline is 10% of total revenue. And when thinking about that as a guideline and thinking about it in the context of our revenue, I find that to be problematic because you're basing your cash off of revenue, which if revenue were to decrease in the case of the income tax being non-renewed, the state funding being cut, or our property tax revenue being cut by House Bill 1, as proposed at the state level right now, which I'll talk about in a minute, we would need to have more cash on hand. So basing our cash balance off of revenue is counterintuitive to what we're trying to accomplish. So instead, we are looking at basing a minimum and a maximum balance off of expenditure data rather than revenue, and actually converting expenditures into days of cash. That is a more relatable metric, I think, for people to understand than a raw dollar value or even a percentage. So I think it helps put things into a little bit better context, terms that you can understand in your everyday life as well. So we talked about the minimum, the reason for having a minimum. The reason for having a maximum is so that we have an accountability process. We are making sure that we are not having too much cash on hand that taxpayers should have themselves. We want to show that we're being fiscally responsible. We don't want to just sit on cash for no other purpose than to have cash. So this policy will actually increase accountability because Jeff and I, as the treasurer and superintendent, would be required to propose a plan to the board if our cash is projected to be below or above the minimum and maximum thresholds being set. So it's really an accountability process that's built into board policy. Okay, so that's the reason for the policy itself. So then I want to talk through how we came up with the actual values that we're proposing.
And Brittany, just reference that this was part of a finance committee
Yes.
recommendation.
Yes, yep. So I think it was 2 or 3 finance committees ago, this concept first got brought up. And overwhelmingly, the feedback from that committee was that this would be a positive to implement. We also shared this presentation with the finance committee and strategic task force last week to get their feedback. And overwhelmingly, the feedback from both groups was very positive and supportive of the policy as well as the numbers that we proposed.
And the Finance Committee is a group of community members who have volunteered to join or those who've asked to join because of their expertise? How does that?
Yes, so I think we have about 35 people on the list of people that get invited. Most of them have some sort of financial background or financial interest in wanting to be part of the committee. But ultimately, yes, there are 2 board member representatives, Jeff and I, a couple of staff members, as well as the rest are community members then.
Yeah, so one of the superintendent committees.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Okay, so first I want to walk through how we're calculating a day of operating cash. So it's going to vary based on each fiscal year because our expenditures change. But you start with your base number of total expenditures for 2023. Divide by 365 days in a year to come up with a daily expenditure rate. So in this case, $92,000. So to come up with the minimum, we just multiply that daily amount by 90, and that gives us about $8.3 million minimum cash balance. Same concept on the maximum side, except we're multiplying that daily amount by 160 to give us a $14.8 million maximum. So that's the simple calculation. Now I'm going to walk through how we came up with the 90 and the 160. So first, there's lots of different ways to do this. There's lots of different recommendations. Lots of different organizations have guidance, sample policies, all sorts of things. But what I liked about the GFOA reserve calculation was that it was very robust. It considered all of these different components and was kind of like a risk assessment, basically, that walked you through each of these different criteria, and you would rate them on a scale of 1 to 5 based on conditions in your particular district. So extreme events, things like wildfires, hurricanes, floods, is relatively low for Granville. But something like revenue stability and expenditure volatility, I would actually today rank revenue stability a 5. Those are more risk, there's more risk involved with those conditions than some of the others.
Can you give us some examples there to kind of help us understand what those mean?
Yeah, so for revenue stability, it walks you through, first asks you to consider your major sources of revenue. So for us, we have property tax, state funding, and income tax. And then it asks how stable, how reliable are those sources of revenue? Well, again, prior to today, I would say property tax revenue is relatively stable. However, now is where I will talk about House Bill 1. So House Bill 1 says that the state, the basis for the bill is the state is trying to move away from a tiered income tax to a flat 2.75% income tax. So that would create a $2 billion deficit at the state level that they're trying to, rather than use the rainy day funds, or rather than use their cash reserve, they're trying to reduce in their expenditures. So a big line item, I want to say like $1.2 billion, is the rollback reimbursement program. So that's where the state pays a portion of property taxes on behalf of taxpayers. So they're proposing to eliminate that program, which would, at surface level, would mean that the burden would then shift to taxpayers. So taxpayers would then pay that 10% that was typically paid by the state, and the school district would remain whole. However, the second piece of the bill says that rather than taxing at 35% of market value, so we went through this a couple meetings ago where take market value times 35% to come up with what is taxed. So rather than 35%, they're proposing 31.5% for that assessed value, which just so happens to be a 10% reduction. So.
And the 35% has been in place since 1972.
Yes.
50 years ago.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we're talking about historic thresholds that are being talked about being changed in this biennium that have catastrophic implications for how things are funded at the local level. So I think this is something that everybody in this room and in this community should be very well versed in. And I'll add on to that afterwards because I don't want to disrupt your presentation, but it's something that's driving me nuts.
So that's some history on the property tax and the reason why revenue stability is ranked where it is, because our three major sources of revenue, so that's property tax, so that could be cut by 10% as soon as House Bill 1 is passed. The income tax is obviously up for renewal in May, and state funding is a big question mark every 2 years, right? Plus then they can always just cut it whenever they want. So it's incredibly important when you have revenue instability to have higher cash balance. So you add up all of your scores from all these different criteria. We have a score of 29, and then it falls into a percentage of expenditure guideline, which I converted on the right hand to days of cash. So we are falling in the 90 to 127 days of cash. So that is where we came up with the 90 for the minimum. So we could have just stuck with this as our minimum and our maximum, 90 to 127, but the purpose of this calculation is to come up with a minimum. It's not to give you a range. So our minimum even could have been 127 days based on this analysis. But we felt like 90 made sense. We fell in the middle range of our score here, so 90 made sense for a minimum. On the maximum side, we did a slightly different approach. So for the maximum, we assumed a worst case scenario where our worst performing year in terms of revenue aligned with our worst, highest expenditure, those two collided in the same year, which also happened to be a good example of 2020, so we used that as our baseline. So we took actual revenue for fiscal year 2020 and subtracted out the income tax, right? So we're just assuming the income tax wouldn't have been renewed in that year to come up with an adjusted revenue rate. Then we applied actual expenditures in that year because, again, we had a large capital project. So yes, if you think about it, we would not have gone on the endeavor of an athletic complex project in the same year that we didn't have the income tax. But this is theoretical. So change the variable slightly. Make it the state reduces state funding in the last 2 months of the fiscal year, and it's an HVAC project that already happened in that fiscal year. It's already even been paid. So it's a decision you made in the past, and then you lost revenue at the end of the year. So yes, these specific examples from 2020 would never happen, but it's just the concepts. So applying the expenditures in that year, so $33 million to the $26 million in revenue, would have resulted in a negative $7 million cash balance. So to get to zero, get to ending cash balance of zero, we would have needed $7 million in cash carried over from the prior year, just to get to zero. Then to get up to our desired ending cash balance of the 90 days, we would have needed another $8.2 million cash and carry over from that prior year as well. So combine those two, and we get to $15.2 million, which equates to 166 days. We rounded down to 160. So really we could be asking for 166. But this again also assumes, like, yes, we are trying to get to our desired ending cash balance, because if we didn't, then we'd also in this same year be having to have a conversation about what are we going to do to rectify that? How are we going to have additional revenue? How are we going to build up our cash balance? So for purposes of the calculation, thought it made sense to assume that we would want to get to that desired ending cash balance. So again, this makes sense, right, in terms of our own district, but let's provide some context. How does this compare to other districts? How does this compare for ourselves in the current fiscal year? So again, we're looking at the same comparison group, those same Central Ohio districts that we are often compared to, looking at what their 5-year forecast says that they will end fiscal year 2023 for days cash on hand. We are projecting 172 days, which is the second lowest on this list. So better value with less cash on hand is the message. And then you might be saying, well, 172, that's outside of your threshold, right? I just said 90 to 160. So what does that look like beyond this current fiscal year? So going back to our annual cash balance graph that we've looked at, I wanted to extend the history on this a little bit because I really think it's important to provide context on the minimum and the maximum. So it gets kind of messy. So I first have the blue line represents the maximum, the proposed maximum cash balance. The yellow is the proposed minimum. And then the green for the years of history is the actual, and then converts to the forecasted amount, assuming the income tax is renewed. Okay? So in fiscal year 2023, the green line is slightly above the blue line, showing that we are projecting to be slightly above that threshold in this fiscal year. However, when we add the cash balance line without the income tax renewal, well, and let me jump back. So in the current year, we're slightly above, but for the next 4 forecasted years, we are really smack dab in the middle of that threshold. So that's kind of a good gut check, like, does this even make sense for our district and our current financial situation? So then throwing up there the cash balance without the levy renewal, and you can see from 25 out through 27, we are below the minimum cash balance and actually negative cash in 26 and 27. So what does that mean for the current year, for fiscal year 2023, since we are above? Well, what the policy says is that Jeff and I would come to the board with a proposal, and what I would say to you today is based on the revenue instability that we are seeing with our three major sources of revenue being in question today, I would recommend we wait and see what happens before we do anything and continue to be fiscally responsible and continue to utilize that cash as best as possible to avoid any unnecessary adjustments down the road. So, is there anything I missed, Jeff, on that?
What I would just add to this conversation is, right now, the state of Ohio has a cash carry over of $6 billion, okay? They also have a rainy day fund. So not just carryover cash, they have a set aside of $3.5 billion. So they have close to $10 billion of carryover cash right now on a $32 or $33 billion budget. So roughly 30% of their annual expenditure is in reserve. So all of the state and local municipalities, everybody utilized COVID dollars. You saw that we had $3 million, okay, that came in federal assistance. If people used it wisely, which we did, and by the way, we got an allocation from the township and the village because they were good neighbors, we use those allocations to defer costs for our tax base. Okay, so as much as possible, we use that federal assistance to delay using our own revenue to fund a lot of the things that Brittany just articulated. So everybody has more cash on hand right now because of that federal assistance. But what I take issue with is this is now, at least in the last 10 years, the third time the state of Ohio has said we're going to impact your ability to either maintain your funding or get new funding. So House Bill 1 impacts us in 3 different ways. It impacts our property tax, it impacts our homestead exemption or our homestead allocation, so moving from a 2.75% homestead credit, it goes down to a flat rate of 125. That disproportionately impacts Granville. Why? Because our property values are higher. So we use that revenue when we don't get other sources of revenue because of our wealth. And the last time that they cut our budget is exactly what Brittany articulated. In the last month of the fiscal year, they removed funding and they never restored it. So this is the third time that the state of Ohio has filled a cash gap or obtained, and this is the first time it's actually, they want to fund a tax reduction at the state level, but shift the burden to the local. And so it's just one of those things that I think every taxpayer should understand that yes, they are potentially lowering your state income tax, but you are going to have to pay somewhere, and that's going to be for schools, for township fees, for village services. You're going to have to pay just a different entity, but the money's still going to have to be paid. So, as you can tell, I'm not a fan of House Bill 1. I also happen to be the chair of the Alliance for High Quality Education. The Alliance is 77 school districts that look very similar to Granville, that are high wealth, high achieving, and we are advocating that this does not move forward. So we're working with the Senate leadership, we're working with the House leadership, and the governor's office to try and stop this. There's actually another proposal that has also been introduced that also achieves a tax reduction, but it takes the money from the rainy day fund. If you remember, The amount of money that they're trying to reduce is $2 billion. The rainy day fund sits at $3.5 billion, the highest ever. Remember, about 8 years ago, we had an $8 billion deficit. So that rainy day fund hasn't existed for a long time. To have $3.5 billion in there and then take money from local entities does not make any sense to me. So I wish Maria DeVito was here from the Advocate, but I'll call her. Just because I think that message needs to get out. And if anyone has any other questions about that, please reach out to me. I actually think this is where parents need to get involved a little. And say, hey, we need to be aware of what's happening at the General Assembly level, because a lot of times it goes under the radar, because it's challenging. Even the budget bill, I mean, it's a 4-month process, and they go into caucus and come out with provisions that were never talked about in the 4 months prior. So things are done behind closed doors, and it's challenging for us to understand how to run our organizations when 3 sources of our revenue are at risk for the next 2 years. So, and beyond. Anyway, I could talk ad nauseum. I'll stop there.
How do you suggest parents get involved?
So talk to your local House representative. So on Thursday, I'm meeting with Thad Claggett, who is our new House representative. So I'm meeting with him on Thursday. So he's brand new to the House, so introduce yourself to him. He's actually one of our vendors here. He's done some work for us because he's a local construction owner. I would say reach out to your senator and say, you know, how you feel. Get educated on it, and then, you know, communicate your displeasure or pleasure, either one.
And you gave us a few talking points to kind of discuss that, but effectively, the reduction in property taxes specifically would mean that in order to pay for our teachers at the same rate roughly and deliver the same services, we would be passing additional property taxes, levies.
Yeah, either additional property taxes or additional income tax, because ultimately we would have a shortfall for us of about, I would say, in between $1.5 and $2 million in the first year.
Per year.
Per year.
Yeah. So that's a big chunk of our budget.
Well, and when you look at the cash balance, again, if you take, let's say, of those 4 years, $8 million out of that, you're starting to see the challenge of stability of funding.
And the other thing too is this impacts levies that are currently in place, but also if you think about a new property tax levy, the millage would actually have to be higher to generate the same amount of revenue because the tax base is lower, at a lower assessed value. So it's actually going to be harder probably to pass a property tax in the future because people see a bigger number. They see now 7 mils instead of 5 mils. That's going to be a harder pill to swallow, even though it would actually mean the same dollar value to them. It's just seeing it in a slightly different term on the ballot would be a change.
So technically, this is a first read
Yes.
of a cash balance policy.
Yes.
So for those in the audience and at home, we always do 2 readings.
This is a much more lengthy
Yes.
explanation of a normal policy than what we have, but yes, it is a first reading of the cash balance policy nonetheless, and would be brought forth next month for a second reading and approval.
Yes.
And this is new for Granville to have a policy formally for a minimum cash balance. And it's new for many organizations to have a maximum. Right? This is not common that we have this, but I think it's the right thing to do. Right? You know, I truly believe that this kind of puts brackets, right, and bounds on our cash balance just to raise a flag. Right? And what it does is it effectively, you know, charges the superintendent and treasurer with coming up with a plan to manage this. So it just will automatically create that feedback mechanism, which I think is healthy and creates conversations amongst the community and amongst the board to responsibly manage the funds. So thank you for coming up with this. I think it makes sense, and I'm looking forward to more community feedback and voting on it this evening and next month.
Thank you.
Thank you. Didn't want to put everyone to sleep.
Yes.
We've reached the time in our agenda when we welcome public comment. If anyone in the audience cares to speak to the board, please step to the microphone, state your name and address, and speak for up to 5 minutes. We'd love to hear your perspective.
Good evening, Jenny Miller, 596 North Pearl Street, Granville. I've attended board meetings on a regular basis over the past 11 years, but this is the first time I've offered official public comment. I thought I should give it a go at least once before the nest is empty, even though I'm not completely convinced that my Denison student will ever leave his feathered digs. With our 4 children spaced only 3.5 years apart, that's 2 graduating with the last 2 Granville classes and 2 graduating next spring. Shane and I have watched a lot of sports: t-ball, baseball, boys and girls soccer, hockey, cross country, girls and boys basketball, football, wrestling, cheerleading, gymnastics, and boys and girls lacrosse. Like Groundhog Day, I keep reliving the annual mandatory OHSAA meetings. The team meals, the sign-up geniuses, the search for my season pass on my phone, the remembering to buy tickets electronically and with a service fee in advance of contests, the frustration with referees, the friendships with parents, the pure drive of Blue Ace athletes, and the unique relationship with coaches. There's not enough money in the world to pay me to coach. Sometimes they are complete strangers, but often they are friends. It is a delicate balance of being supportive to the coach while still being empathetic with my children. There also is a distinct line between when a coach wears their community member hat and when they put on their coach hat. When the coach hat goes on and it's game time, I know it's time for me to put on the supportive hat and let everyone just do their job. I speak from experience when it comes to playing time. At the high school level, sometimes it just doesn't happen. I watched one of my children see a sport all the way through their senior year, working and pushing themselves to be a faster, stronger, and more prepared player with each passing year. There simply weren't enough spots on the field at game time. And it was heartbreaking to watch. Mama Bear wanted to be upset with someone, anyone. That kid respected their teammates, trusted the wisdom of their coaches, and the world continued to spin. And I am living proof at 51 of lifelong learning because I learned a lot from that kid. Humility and grace. You are voting to renew many coaching positions this evening, something you do at nearly every monthly meeting. And I want to sing the praises of 2 head coaches, Tara Parsley for girls lacrosse and Bob Higginbotham for boys lacrosse. No one is making a monetary fortune here, but they are providing a wealth of opportunities for every single one of the athletes that wish to make the seasonal journey with them. Just as we value the whole child, so do these individuals value the whole team. I especially wish to thank Coach Bob for championing good mental health. He asks his team how they are doing, and he keeps the lines open. Each year at the parents' meeting, he warns us. He tells us that he will say, "I love you," to our sons. And he does, and he does. For the record, I feel the same about a whole host of educators and staff and leaders in the Granville school system. And I thank you for this opportunity to commend our coaches and all that Josh Duvall is doing in the athletic department. They make us, all of us, proud to be Blue Ace.
Anybody top that? Not ever in my experience. Seeing no more public comment here in the room, I wanted to remind everyone that the board welcomes comments of the community members by email or phone or in any way in person. So thank you very much, Jenny, and thank you for the rest of the community for your feedback.
And unfortunately, I have to follow Jenny. Yes,
So we're in
So board discussion, and I would like to frame it.
Great, fantastic, thank you.
So, another aspect of changing policy is the fact that the Auditor of State has produced a couple of documents that are providing local communities ways of doing business when they have levy campaigns. And so a first draft went out, it got a lot of feedback back to him. They have released a second draft, so this, just for clarifications, is part of a second draft of levy guidance for local school districts and municipalities. So this impacts school districts, townships, trustees, and anyone that is going to the ballot for funding. So what we did was we cherry-picked 10 of the 30 guidance statements that we thought were most important for you to kind of talk or maybe consider from a discussion standpoint. So that, ultimately we're going to try and provide feedback to the Auditor of State just related to this guidance. So right now the Auditor of State is Keith Faber. Keith spent several years in the Senate. He was the Senate President for many years. So he is currently the Auditor of State. This is a lot of little words.
Yeah, that's a lot.
But I will let you know, Cecile, what they say. So remember, there's 30 in totality, and I'm only talking about 10, but I think there are 10 that everyone needs to hear. So district administrators compensated for working irregular hours who get elected to engage in activities that support or oppose a levy will have a high burden to show that public time was not used. So one of the issues is a lot of times, and Jenny, I can use you specifically, a community resident opens up their home for a community coffee, all right? And they invite maybe a member of the levy committee and the superintendent. I would argue I probably have the most irregular hours of any employee in the school district. And I think that is hard to show when it's my time or public time. Because if I go grocery shopping, if someone has a complaint, sometimes I'm shopping, but I'm superintendent. All right, so, but I would have a high burden to show when I am working on levy campaigns. So they are establishing this notion of a high burden, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. The Auditor of State has shifted levy activity and levy responsibility to elected board members and a levy committee. So previously, prior to some of this guidance, the leading authorities were the treasurer and the superintendent. And we provided a lot of information, and we've always taken the point of educate, don't advocate. Obviously, some of the things that we say sound like we're advocating, but it is just representation of actual data that represents that we're of good value, okay? That responsibility is now shifting to local board members who are elected, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, and you guys probably know more about the school district than anyone else, but it is like an intentional shift, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Districts can include factual information about a levy in a newsletter that is not designed to influence voters or to support or oppose a levy. So we have an obligation to inform the electorate. That is an obligation, so we can include some of that information, but it can't include language like vote yes or support our schools if it's coming from the district. Now, a levy committee can do whatever they want to advocate for on our behalf, and a committee opposed can do the same, okay? District can present information about potential cuts that the board has announced if a levy fails, as long as the information is neutral, accurate, and factual. This is problematic, okay? Because we have a collective bargaining process that governs a reduction in force. So we have a collective bargaining agreement that we have to comply with, and then we have another standard that we have to meet from a board kind of designated way of articulating a potential reduction. So this is going to be something that we're going to have to navigate. Obviously, you've already made a decision to place the ballot issue on in May. But this is something that we're going to be wrestling with in how do we kind of share with the community what's at risk without it being a violation of the Auditor of State's opinion, okay?
And also without it being a violation of the collective bargaining agreement, is that what I'm hearing? Okay.
Correct.
And those, it seems like those are two different, like,
They are,
okay,
but they're two different things, they collide.
right,
Yeah.
right. They're not asking you to present information in a neutral, accurate, and factual way. They're asking for something, or that
Yeah,
agreement is
yes.
something different than,
Yeah.
okay.
Board members may play a role in the formation of a levy committee, so long as their activity is not at a board meeting, all right? So we are currently a board, because we are currently in session publicly. You are technically only a board when 5 of you are together. Individually, you are just an individual board member, but you're not the actual board. So they are saying there's a bright line now that you can work outside of this meeting to try and get people to support the levy, but you can't do it in the context of your board.
But that only says formation of a levy committee. Are
Correct.
we even allowed, like, the third one, the whatever, the second one is saying we can support a levy and work towards that, but this one is just saying formation.
Right, remember, this is 10 of 30.
Oh.
So we're gonna do a
You thought it
deeper
wasn't even paying
dive.
attention,
Yes,
right?
yes. We're gonna do a deeper dive to make sure that you understand the rules of engagement
Okay.
moving forward.
Okay, but with respect to number 5,
Yes,
if 3 of us get together, that's a quorum.
that's correct.
It's a separate thought that we can't break.
Right, that's a quorum, and that's a violation of sunshine
Right,
law, and so you can't do that either.
right.
Yeah.
I just wanted to
Yeah.
clarify that we can't all advocate
At the same time.
whether we're in this room or not.
Correct,
We could all
There are 3 of us.
advocate independently,
yes.
right, and have separate meetings.
But
yeah.
not
But
together.
we can't do
Separate
anything
subcommittees.
school-related when there's 3 or more of us together. Anyway,
That's correct.
yeah, nothing school, levy, nothing.
So this one actually impacts me directly. If a public employee plays a role in the levy, there will be a high burden, again, same language in quotes, on the employee to establish they are not on public time. Employees should not engage in levy activity during a regular school day, at board meetings for a district-sponsored event where employees are paid to be present or a part of their district position. Now, the Auditor of State suggests a superintendent or treasurer residing in the district, which I do, has a stronger First Amendment protection, but the employee needs to document their activity related to the levy campaign to demonstrate it's on their own time. So, I mean, traditionally, Sundays are reserved for the Brown family, okay? I say traditionally. Sometimes it's not. But, you know, other than that, there are very few times where someone couldn't argue that I am representing the school district in some form or fashion. So it's just an interesting piece of information. Brittany living outside of the school district might have a little bit of a different way of documenting her burden. The next piece. So again, the district official may only provide factual information to the media and should not advocate for or against the passage of the levy. Information should be neutral and factual. I try and do that to the best of my ability all the time. That's just a good standard best practice. But it should be clearly stated in my job duties and responsibilities. I've been in the superintendency for 12 years. I was a superintendent in Olentangy before, and there have always been previous examples where levy passage was in my goals. So now that's not allowed. So that's something that we'll have to adjust and work on.
But the district may want to consider having board-adopted statements of fact as to why the levy is needed and note the implications if the levy or bond issue fails. So this is where they're saying, in the board meeting, you articulate the factual information so that it can be utilized outside of that format, okay? And be communicated via district information if that is factual and relevant.
Up until now, it was district employee or board member. Now it's district official.
Correct.
So
Yes.
what lies under that umbrella?
That would not necessarily be the board member, because they've specifically delineated those throughout the guidance. District employees may respond to a taxpayer question with neutral factual information. So it is very common for somebody to come up to me and say, tell me why I should support this. I'm going to tell them I'm not going to tell you to support it. I'm going to tell you factual information and you can make your own decision. That's an awkward way of doing business, but that's the way I'm going to do it.
And is that for teachers as well?
That says district employees,
Yeah.
so yes.
So bus drivers too.
Bus drivers, anyone, district employees.
That's going to be an education process.
Yeah.
Another
Another
thing
thing
is,
is,
that's not even on company time?
right, that's correct.
Oh, not even on,
No, that's
no matter what.
no matter what, whether they're,
But you typically
But
be
typically.
responding to taxpayer questions during business hours. Like, I'm not gonna respond to an email
Well,
about the
What if your
district
name is
finance.
teacher,
No, but what
though?
about, yeah, what
What
if
if
you're
your name's
having drinks
teacher
with
and
your
you're- yeah.
teacher friend and?
Yeah. This is an interesting one. A district may not thank the community for passing a levy or bond. So, and the township trustees and I just had all of us had conversations. I mean, it's very common to put out a message saying, thank you for your support. You know, the library does it, the fire department had a cookout saying thank you. That's what we do in Granville. So this guidance says that's a no-no. Surveys should not be designed to gauge community support of a levy or a bond issue or gauge support for different types of levies. So again, in the past, there have been times where we've said, you know, what do you prefer, so to speak, and that's no longer allowable. So,
Excuse me, that's the district cannot do a survey.
correct.
A levy committee could, but
Yeah.
If they
Yeah,
wanted to.
if they wanted to.
I guess you wouldn't.
And originally, the guidance too said, I mean, this doesn't say this, but it was also like things that look like surveys. So like you couldn't have like a community meeting even to take a vote or get feedback that way, if it looked like a survey to gauge community support.
It's a curious position that we're put in. So for example, if our minimum cash balance policy says that we're going to be below the minimum, you have to come and make a proposal to the board about how we resolve that. You can't get input from the community about different types of taxes. Right? So how would the school district make a decision about what to put, how to solve our financial issues with this constraint? It's an interesting position these guidelines put us in.
I think, in general, my response to that would be, you pay us to give you opinions and perspectives all the time. We would be advancing that plan based on what we know about the district's best interest. And so, but it does, I mean, we have strategic planning task force and finance committees and other groups that inform us in a lot of different ways. This makes it a little less smooth and a little bit more clunky and awkward. And so I think the most important piece of what I'm sharing with you today, we highlighted a few, but I think it's important for the board to understand all the 30 recommendations and potentially when those are finalized so that you can protect yourself from potential violations of the Auditor of State. And there have been 2 recent cases where a superintendent and board members were charged criminally and pled out so that they didn't have a record because they said
thank you to their community.
I'm not thanking anybody for nothing,
Yeah.
ever again.
So anyway, I want to make this a little bit more public because I think it changes the dynamic of how we operate as an organization in totality. I mean, we are very much an open door organization. And so it potentially makes it a little bit more awkward. We're going to find the right way to move forward, but I just want to be very cautious for people sitting around this table because you're all very vested in the school district. You all care very passionately about what happens, and we want you to, be able to live within the confines and not potentially violate something that the auditor of state has advanced. So,
Do we know how many drafts he's gonna,
I believe
going to
that,
accept?
yeah, I believe that this will probably be the last iteration. Because honestly, they need to get something out before the May election. So,
Well, your comments that, the board has been passionate supportive of education is not different than the rest of the community to some extent, right? And we have a lot of community members that are really passionate about this organization and the kids and the results that we have. But it's a different context and it's a different warning of how we need to manage that. It really does put a lot of, not burden, but opportunity for a levy committee, should one be formed to support the upcoming levy, to really take the lead on this and become the experts and use the factual information that we can provide as a district to be able to spread the message in the community, right? And it's going to take a lot more careful analysis on the part of that committee to be able to do that translation and to be able to send that out. It's my feeling that, like you said, just presenting the facts by themselves is the key and the thing that we should always do. And the thing that I've strove to do as well. How we present those facts relative to the implications of a levy not passing, we need to be more careful with, right? And so I think we will need to find a way to present those scenarios, and maybe, as the levy draws closer, we'll need to make a request to you, because you have the facts about what the implications would be of not passing the levy, so that it can be cleanly communicated to the community. So I'm not sure I'm ready to make that request now, but at some time we'll need some clarity on what the options are, so that the community understands that.
yes.
So, yeah.
One thing I'd like to add, as long as I've lived here, I think during Jeff's tenure and Brittany's, they've done an outstanding job of always advocating, educating. Pardon me.
Thanks. I'm going to get a report tomorrow.
No, advocating, not educating. Yeah, sorry, I'm going to be quiet. No, they've done an outstanding job of telling the facts. So regardless of this guidance, I think you continue doing that, so.
I think it's hard to, when you tell the facts, it feels like you're advocating and celebrating because we're doing really well. Like when you just state the facts about what our performance index is that advocating?
Right.
No, it's just stating the facts, right? When you talk about the finances and how we maintain them so well, people might accuse us of advocating, of not spending very much money, right? But that's the facts, right? And I think those facts speaks for themselves. If you look at the history and you look at the results and things like that, I think the facts just speak for themselves. And I know that the community has been long-term supporters of education, and I know we'll find a way through this and all the growth that's coming our way and so forth. But it's in a different context that we need to be careful of. So thanks for reminding us of that.
Yep. More to come.
Yeah. Anything more on that? Or?
I don't understand the prohibition on thanking the community. If it's already passed,
Because then we look like advocates.
There are several components of their guidance that I have no understanding why, because it wouldn't be influential.
right,
So, thanking a community doesn't influence, it's already happened.
Right.
So,
Does it influence the next one?
they could argue that. I'm assuming they could probably argue a lot. But it doesn't necessarily pass the common sense
I hope the auditor never thanks his supporters.
What's a post-election victory party all about, right?
Just wonder.
The district.
Yeah, just not at this level.
Yep,
No, thank you for that.
you're welcome. Okay, action agenda?
I think so.
Excellent. Okay, we have the renewal of the lease with Ohio Guidestone for the next school year.
So moved.
Second.
Any comments or questions? So Ohio Guidestone is our mental health provider that is on premises at the middle school, but serves K-12.
I've heard great things about what they're doing with our students and things like that, and I think the strength of the linkage by, bringing them in and then having external resources when needed, but being available to students when needed is going to continue to be really important. I know that they're highly utilized and there's ever more opportunities there for health and wellness. I hope we're being as proactive as we are reactive with our health and wellness initiatives. So
We try.
yeah, thank you. The roll, please.
Ms. Shaw?
Aye.
Mr. Wolf?
Aye.
Ms. Deeds?
Aye.
Mr. Cronk?
Aye.
Mr. Miller?
Aye.
9.02 is the approval of the Granville Village Planning Commission representative.
So moved. Second.
Okay, Jeremy King has agreed to be our representative for the school board. It is an ex officio non-voting member of the Village Planning Commission, but it is obviously in a high-growth environment where a lot of homes or other things can be going through village planning. Important to have a person that is willing to sit and digest that information and report back to the board. So we appreciate Mr. King's willingness to serve in that capacity.
He's a great person for the job. Thank you for doing that. The roll, please.
Ms. Deeds?
Aye.
Ms. Shaw?
Aye.
Mr. Cronk?
Aye.
Mr. Wolf?
Aye.
Mr. Miller?
Aye.
Thank you. 9.02 or 9.03 is the approval of the 23-24 school calendar.
So moved. Second.
Okay, and just so you know, there's a process in the collective bargaining agreement. Mr. Burdett facilitates the construction of the school calendar. There are some legal requirements with alignment to CTEC's calendar because we are a member school of CTEC. So all of those have been satisfied. This is the second reading and approval.
And so that's for spring break, we align with CTEC.
It's for the start of school, spring break, other things, yeah.
So this PDF will be posted on the website, and we will have a link for iCalendar, so you can download and synchronize shortly. So if you go out to the website, hopefully we'll have that, so you don't have to put all these things in from the PDF yourself. You should be able to have them directly download into your calendar.
You can hang it on your refrigerator.
You can do that. Old-fashioned. Good roll, please.
Ms. Deeds?
Aye.
Ms. Shaw?
Aye.
Mr. Cronk?
Aye.
Mr. Wolf?
Aye.
Mr. Miller?
Aye.
Okay, 9.04 is our OHSAA membership resolution for the 23-24 school year.
So moved.
Second.
We do align membership, so we do agree with all of their policies and procedures and practices through this membership.
Have they changed the cost of that or?
No, okay, it's still the same.
Roll, please.
Mr. Wolf?
Aye.
Ms. Deeds?
Aye.
Mr. Cronk?
Aye.
Ms. Shaw?
Aye.
Mr. Miller?
Aye.
Okay, consent agenda 10.01, A through C, D, through A through D.
So moved.
I'll second.
So I want to highlight a few things. So we have received an OFCC safety grant in the amount of $300,000. Tanya Sherburne, who operates the safety committee, submitted a grant on our behalf. There are also elements of the governor's executive budget that are safety related, so we'll learn more about that, but that $300,000 will be allocated across the four buildings specifically. Granville Education Foundation announced their grants. So as you can see, we have quite a few grants that will be supported. Some of them are student grants, some of them are classroom grants, but all fantastic. We appreciate Granville Education Foundation supporting all the endeavors in and outside of the school. A couple other highlights. We'd like to recognize Donna Fouch, who is in the treasurer's office, as a member of the treasurer's team. She is retiring. She's been with us for quite a few years, and she's made the decision to retire effective July 31st. I'd also note that she's not going to say it herself, but I'll say it publicly. So Brittany is basically with Carrie Butler, the only two in the treasurer's office. Typically, there's 4 people in that environment, but after the levy failure, we did not post for those positions to be refilled. We will post a position to get back into so that we have at least one other person that can do the work that Brittany does. They won't be able to do the work that she does, but it will be another person in the office. So that will be forthcoming.
It says superintendent submits with appreciation, but really I should have put superintendent treasurer.
Treasurer,
So
yeah.
appreciate that.
Yes, absolutely.
The entire board does.
Resignation, we also had Sandra Hamlin, bus driver, so obviously we appreciate all of our bus drivers. We want more of them, not less of them. So if you know anybody with the CDL or wants to get a CDL, we'll train you. So, and that was advocacy. Just being real clear. And then we have a whole bunch of field trips, which I hope the board appreciates as much as we do, because there was a period of time where we didn't get to do these things, and it's nice to be doing them again. So, and we've had a lot of very successful student endeavors recently, so that's good. Any questions on the consent agenda?
The Cheez-It Bowl.
Cheez-It Bowl, yes.
It's a good one.
Yeah.
The grants are fantastic. I mean, the safety grant is a huge one that's going to go a long way for a lot of different parts of our schools. As I read through the list of Granville Education Foundation grants, I'm like, really thinking those look like really cool projects, right? They all look like they're great ones. So thanks very much to the teachers and the students for coming up with those. And thanks for all those who support the Granville Education Foundation. Without that foundation, we wouldn't be able to support these kinds of innovation learning grants. So that's fantastic. The roll, please.
Ms. Shaw?
Aye.
Mr. Cronk?
Aye.
Ms. Deeds? Mr. Wolf?
Aye.
Mr. Miller?
Aye. Thank you. Takes us to finance.
Item 11.01, approval of the January 2023 financial report.
So moved. Second.
That's all I have to say on it. Oh, it's talked for 45 minutes.
Oh, that's great. The roll, please.
Okay. Ms. Deeds?
Aye.
Ms. Shaw?
Aye.
Mr. Cronk?
Aye.
Mr. Wolf?
Aye.
Mr. Miller?
Aye.
Item 11.02, resolution filed complaint against the valuation of real property tax for tax year 2022.
So moved.
Second.
So this will be now an annual resolution. Again, this is a result of legislation at the state level that requires board approval in this process in order for the district to challenge any values. It requires a board resolution. There's also now a dollar threshold, so we used to have 2+ pages of different properties that we were able to challenge the value, which directly generates additional property tax revenue. And now we are limited to just a few properties that are listed here. So again, another small way that our ability to generate revenue is being challenged at the state level. So, any questions?
So if these organizations that are proposing for a lower value than they've recently purchased the properties are approved, does it change our revenue, or does it shift the burden in the reappraisal process to all the rest of the taxpayers?
Since this is for tax year 2022 and tax bills have already gone out, it will directly increase revenue.
Okay. And it would impact going forward
Correct.
the tax shift, right?
Yes.
So basically, these organizations are looking to shift the burden from themselves to the rest of the community members. And reduce the revenue for past year. Okay.
Who determines which way it's decided, since we filed the resolution or passed the resolution, who determines?
The board.
Oh, the county auditor, and the board, yeah,
The Board of Appeals.
yeah.
BOA.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry, I was confused, I thought you were asking how we determine which properties
No.
to judge, but we do have a firm that handles this process for us as well, because there's a lot of legal requirements with all the filings and hearings, and there's a lot involved. And they actually do a really nice analysis for us every year, of like, here was what we paid them, here's the additional revenue that was generated, and it's always a overwhelmingly cost-effective process to continue.
Since the school is the largest recipient of property taxes, are there other organizations that might challenge the proposed reappraisal? So if an individual just says, hey, I think my house should be worth half as much, is there any check or balance on that?
I'm not
Tax
sure
burden,
if
not sure
other municipalities challenge property values.
Probably have some of the same constraints though.
Yes.
Okay.
It probably wouldn't be cost effective on their end because it is, I mean, they're only getting pennies on the dollar for what we're getting, so.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
The roll, please.
Ms. Shaw? Aye. Mr. Wolf?
Aye.
Ms. Deeds? Aye. Mr. Cronk?
Aye.
Mr. Miller?
Aye.
Okay, item 11.03, resolution accepting amounts and rates.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, this is another annual resolution, and it is again for tax year 2022. So if you think about that, tax bills have already gone out for fiscal year 20, or for tax year 2022. So this is really just a formality that we're approving after the fact. Tax bills have already gone out, we just simply have to approve them as part of that annual process. We have had some discussions about, well, what would it look like if we were to forego collection on a property tax in the future? For example, if you're outside of our cash balance policy, that would be a separate resolution. I believe that would have to be filed like in the September timeframe so that that gets incorporated in the tax rates for the subsequent year. So not this resolution, this is simply a formality, but keep that in mind for future timing.
Would it make sense, or would it be possible for the board to pass this resolution in the fall at a time when we could make a change if needed, or do we not?
We
know
don't
the
have
rates
the
by-
rates to approve them. We don't have values. We don't know the rates till you have values and.
Right.
Whole-
Okay.
yeah. We approve it as soon as we get it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
Roll.
Ms. Deeds? Mr. Cronk?
Aye.
Ms. Shaw? Aye. Mr. Wolf?
Aye.
Mr. Miller?
Aye.
Okay, item 11.04, approval of the then and now resolution.
So moved.
Second. This is a requirement if we have an invoice that is dated prior to a purchase order. So this was kind of something that slipped through the cracks with the HVAC project at the elementary. So we're paying Superior for the temporary heating, and the rest of the contract was with training. So we had the purchase order in place for the training portion, and kind of missed this portion being paid to Superior. So we have the funds available. That's why it's called a then and now. They were available then, and they are now as well. Requires board approval because it's over $3,000.
Thank you for being so good at taking that. The roll, please.
Mr. Wolf?
Aye.
Ms. Shaw? Aye. Ms. Deeds? Aye. Mr. Cronk?
Aye.
Mr. Miller?
Aye.
Item 11.05, approval of the permanent appropriation resolution for fiscal year ending June 30th, 2023.
So moved. Second.
This is kind of a three-step process that I'm trying to get better at. When we approve grants, we are also going to approve the permanent appropriation resolution to typically increase the appropriation to account for them. And then the next will be the resolution to establish the account. So when we get these unexpected grants that we did not budget for at the beginning of the year, those are going to be the three items that you'll see as agenda. So this is for the safety grant. We always, the GEF grants we expect, we anticipate, so we kind of create a contingency that allows us flexibility throughout the year, but obviously a $300,000 safety grant we did not anticipate in June when we approved the original appropriations.
We'll take it.
Yes. Ms. Deeds?
Aye.
Ms. Shaw?
Aye.
Mr. Cronk?
Aye.
Mr. Wolf?
Aye.
Mr. Miller?
Aye.
Item 11.06, a resolution to establish the account for the Ohio K-12 safety grant.
So moved.
Second.
Any additional questions on that? Mr. Wolf?
Aye.
Ms. Shaw?
Aye.
Ms. Deeds?
Aye.
Mr. Cronk?
Aye.
Mr. Miller?
Aye. I would like to consider a motion to discuss the employment of a public employee or official in executive session.
So moved. Second.
Ms. Deeds?
Aye.
Ms. Shaw? Aye. Mr. Cronk?
Aye.
Mr. Wolf?
Aye.
Mr. Miller?
Aye. There will be no action items after the adjournment, so thank you very much.
Motion.
Or do you want to switch?